Rhetoric has a patriarchal bias that leads it to be about conquering others, I guess you would say. Conquering or changing others. And I'm not so sure. I would like to argue that not necessarily. It's about, in practical situations, finding the best way to proceed. But as rhetoric gets used a lot, I can agree with them. But I think you have to understand is they're kind of not setting up a straw man, but they are presenting a very particular view of rhetoric. And rhetoric is larger than that. So, but they go through this idea of Western culture that humans are here to take over the environment and use it for their own purposes rather than live together with it in some kind of harmony. And they want to get out of that. So they want to have a different kind of rhetoric that is not about let me help you, let me enlighten you. And so they want a form that invites people to hear and see different ways of viewing things. Now, does anybody want to comment on any of that first? A lot of other theories in there. Ben?
I thought this one was actually interesting, although I didn't like having to read through all the whining, I guess I would call it at the beginning. You know, where they're just like, maybe like you're saying, like, you know, we're trying to take over the world when we talk and all this stuff. But other than that, it was kind of interesting how they said if you let people talk, you allow them to learn about themselves and things like that.
Right. Yeah, so she's arguing, this is kind of, if you study rhetorical theories of feminism, there's something called standpoint theory, which argues that people perceive reality from the social, economic places where they exist, and they speak from that place. Their language comes from that place. And so they are often unintelligible to others who don't stand in that place. They can't understand. Why would someone think that way? Why would somebody say those things? So one of the things I've done with students in standpoint theory is to study human trafficking. We look at human trafficking and the children who get used in the tourist sex trades, you know, over in Asia and all. And so they have a standpoint on life, and they would talk about their lives in a way that's unintelligible to other people who are in different situations. So there's a little bit of standpoint theory in here. There's a little bit of muted group theory, which is the idea that all language is patriarchal language, and women are at a disadvantage in giving voice to women's experience because they have to use men's language to give voice to their experience. And so what we need are new languages in order for women to speak their experience. And so we have women creating new languages, Cheris Kramer and others creating women's languages to give voice. So yeah, so I don't know. I am a little bothered by, I understand the arguments. I like to see rhetoric as more involved with the civic life, the city, and determining what's best. And so I think she's got a truncated view of what it is. But nonetheless, she wants to have invitational rhetoric as an invitation to understanding as a means to create a relationship rooted in equality, immanent value, and self-determination. Now, that has a lot of resonance with our phenomenological perspective and dialogue, because it's very closely related to the idea that what we need is to broaden our horizons and listen to each other and seek understanding, which is the goal of phenomenology, is understanding. So, but she's treating it as a rhetoric because it is a set of directions for the creation of interaction between people. So it's a rhetoric. It's a set of guidelines for reaching your goals. And so she talks about offering perspectives instead of telling others what their perspective should be. It's an offering, it's an opening of self's world of feeling, attitude, and then inviting the other to do the same. Offering yourself may occur in different settings. You know, when she does this, I don't know what you're all thinking. I mean, she does say at times, this is not the rhetoric for every place and every situation. You know, because
I feel like it's kind of like a talk show or something like that,
right.
You know. But I kind of feel like on really important things, like I guess when I was reading, I was like, okay, so what's the answer? You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
And all of them, I like read through it. I'm like, okay, so what do you do to do it right, or you know, like to get the answer? And for this, I guess it's kind of like, okay, two roommates don't get along. You do your thing in your room, I'll do my thing in my room, and we'll get along and live in the same house together. But when you have like big issues, such as like political issues or you know, like religious issues or something, people will be like, okay, this is mine and this is that. You know, like if two opinions strongly oppose each other, you can only have, you know, there are times when you can only have one. Either
right.
You do it or you don't. And I feel that it just like, you know, like, you know,
right.
It stops.
Well, I agree. I saw some challenges to this. I have friends who work in police and prison systems, you know, and you know, this is not the way things would work for them. You know, there are people you don't want to be offering yourself to, you know, because
But I just felt like it was a really long time
it's
to get a solution to.
yeah, but there are places where this is important to do. I think they're trying to say that this is an option that doesn't get used as often as it ought to get used. Jerry Phillipson did work on speech codes theory. I don't know if you're familiar with that yet. We haven't really covered it yet. Where he studied South Chicago in Teamsterville. He called it Teamsterville. And he found a speech code, a speech culture, where it was inappropriate to talk, for males to talk to each other to resolve problems, or to correct other males by talking. You used force or coercion. And so that was a speech culture that existed. Jerry Phillipson also did a study of a speech culture out in Santa Barbara, California. And he named that one the Nasarima culture, which is American spelled backwards. And the Nasarima culture is a culture of mutual respect, equality, self-revealing, acceptance of others. This is very much a Nasarima speech culture code, according in Jerry Phillipson's terms. So, but there are some interesting points to it. One is that she says on page 149, a refusal to engage in conflict or interaction under the terms proposed by a rhetor. So that means that they want you to be aware that when someone engages you in a certain approach to conversation, you don't have to buy into their model of it. You can change the model. You don't have to cooperate with the rules of that code. And so she tells a story of the protesters and the arrest in the gym there. Did you read that one about the women in the gym? It's on page 149, 150. They were blockading the Livermore weapons lab, protesting. Other women were arrested, held in a school gym. During their confinement, a woman was chased into the gym by 6 guards. She dove into a cluster of women. They held on to her as the guards pulled at her legs, trying to extract her from the group. Guards were on the verge of beating the woman when one woman sat down and began to chant. As the other women followed suit, the guard's actions changed in response. Okay, so that's one of her key examples, where she's going to argue that what happened was they changed the rules of the rhetorical engagement from one of force to one of offering. And it reshaped. They didn't know how to encounter that change of rhetorical situation. So they didn't know what to do with it.
Is there a difference between feminine and feminist when we talk about theory? Is she saying that these approaches are essentially feminine, or is she? That's where I kind of get lost. I mean, is she saying that this springs from the heart of women and it would never spring from the heart of a man? I always want to ask that whenever people say feminist theory. I think, Martin Luther King kind of also reshaped the argument by leading a peaceful march, by...
Right. Yeah, change the rhetoric, so to speak.
Right.
The situation.
So I wonder, at this point, when we say feminist theory, are we saying a philosophy of women that springs from womenkind, or are we saying a philosophy that embraces, both sexes' perspectives?
Those of you who've taken more women's studies can help me with this. Does anybody want to take a shot at that? I'd be willing to say yes and no, because there would be some women who would say, well, no, we're just saying that that's the way culture shapes, the gender of women, and so it's really a culture-gender issue. But there will probably be other people who say it is a feminine issue, right? That there are biological bases for this.
There's something on the news today on Channel 4, and it was saying that it was talking about emotion and how men and women deal with emotion, and then physically they deal with it differently, and that it's more harmful for women's hearts when they get into kind of smoking. It has the same effect of smoking stuff, being in negative relationships or negative friendships, just because trying to make a thing
Again, I think you have to be careful. We've talked about this before, that you have variation and means. So you might say, well, men are like this and women are like this. But that doesn't mean to say that some men are more like women and some women are more like men, and whatever it is you're talking about, whether stress. But maybe the distribution and the variance is different. I'd have to look at it.
I just thought it was. Yeah. I don't know. I didn't. Obviously, they don't tell you that much about the study, but they were saying that how they physically respond to it, a majority, the physical response.
Yeah. Good. It may well be. So, Jeffrey, the answer to the question is, probably you would get people who'd say both things.
Right.
Yeah, sorry. On page 151, Celia Ben-Habib is a communitarian writer, and part of their thing is this idea of principle of universal moral respect, the rights of all beings capable of speech and action to be participants in the conversation. So, again, going back to Socrates and Plato and all, that again is a very democratic perspective versus the idea that some people can't be taught and some people should just be persuaded. So this is a very respect of all persons democratic approach to things. Readers celebrate the unique and individual identities of audience members. So it listens, it hears, and it values the other and transforms. So her big example is the woman on the shuttle bus, which is a famous story that you'll hear over and over again in different places. That this one woman she got into a shouting match with this man at the airport about women's rights, and then they ended up on the same shuttle bus sitting next to each other because it was the only seats left in the bus. And so they just started to talk, and to talk about, well, where'd you grow up? What was your life like? What were your experiences in life? And they each began to discover that the other had you know, reasons for who they were. And they offered, her language is they offered each other themselves, you know. And then by the time they got there, then they got off the bus and they ended up that their cars were parked near each other, so they saw each other again, and they ran over and gave each other a hug because they felt like something had happened. Neither had changed their views, but something had happened different. And they had more respect for each other even if they didn't change their views. So, you know, there are a lot of people who think that this is kind of a place where it's virtually the only way we're going to get through the next 100 years, you know, is if these kinds of things happen. Because if we are in a rhetoric of conquest where we're going to kill you if you don't believe the way we do or think the way we do, or we're going to persuade you, we're not doing so good that way. So maybe there's something in invitational rhetoric that we need to understand. But again, you know, I'm very mindful of the fact that this is a Nasarima speech code, you know, and there are people in the world you want to stay away from, you know, and you don't want to sit on the bus next to, and you don't want to reveal things about yourself to them. You know, I have a student in another class who tutors in a prison, and they're very rigid about what they say. Look, you don't tell anything about your personal life, you don't talk about your life outside here, you don't do any favors for them, you don't carry messages, you just do, you teach them what you're teaching them, and that's all you do. And I don't know if you've had the unfortunate experience of encountering predators or sociopaths, but they exist, and they would love this world because everyone would just open up to them and they just gobble them up, you know. So you got to be a little careful, right? So be careful who you talk to on the bus. That's what so, but it's a good article, and she's got a point that we need to think about how we're going to live into the future. All right, so that's rhetoric. Any other thoughts, questions? I know Joe Jamara was interested in rhetoric, and he's not here, but he's going to get the video, so he'll get that. He got sick. He couldn't be here tonight. So any other thoughts or questions? Write me if this didn't work well for you, though. I mean, this was a lot of upfront stuff. If I felt like you were still there, but write me and tell me we really weren't, you know, or don't talk so much next time, you know. Do more examples. So, okay, we're done. And I'm going to go watch Ramapo women's volleyball.